On the 16th September 1968, in Rushville, Indiana, a 21-year-old black woman, Carol Jenkins, traveled to Martinsville, Indiana, with three of her coworkers, who were two white men and a 19-year-old black woman. They went to sell encyclopedias. Apparently, it was Carol's first day at her new job. Unfortunately, Martinsville was a racist city, which was dominated by white people. They never allowed black people to live there, and if they were to visit that city, they were to leave before sunset and return to wherever they came from, failure to which they would be subjected to violence, lynching, and other forms of racial terror. Unfortunately, on that day, the sun was able to set while Carol was still in that city, so they murdered her. Human life is so sacred, and it is such an abominable thing to murder someone just because she has a black color. This is the story of Carol Jenkins. Carol Marie Jenkins was born on April 21, 1947, in Franklin, Indiana. Her mother was known as Elizabeth Jenkins. When Carol was still an infant, her mother divorced her biological father and later married a man known as Paul Davis. Paul worked as a machine repairman for the Ford Motor Company, which was a local factory based in Rushville, Indiana. So the family lived in Rushville in the year 1960s. Rushville was a predominantly white town. It was more of a small, close-knit community, and fortunately, they were not racist like other cities in Indiana. Paul Davis loved Carol very much as his biological daughter, so he raised her as his first child, and he was always present in her life. Later on, Elizabeth and Paul went on and had 5 more children. They were blessed with 2 boys and 3 girls. One of their children was known as Robert. They also had their youngest child, who was known as Laura Davis Watkins. Carol attended Rushville High School when she was a teenager. She was actually one of the only black kids in the whole school, but fortunately, while in this school, she faced very little racism, which was a very unique experience for her. After she graduated from high in the year 1965, her goal was to become a model, so she had a big dream of one day relocating to Chicago to start her career. Despite her ambition to pursue a career in modeling, she realized that the path to success in Chicago was not as easy as she had initially thought. So she decided to stay in Rushville, where she got an assembly line job at Ford Motor Company's Philco plant. She worked there until union strike temporarily shut the plant down, thereby rendering her jobless. She started looking for a new job, and eventually she found a job of selling encyclopedias for colliers. The job entailed going door to door so that you can make a sell. On the 16th September 1968, it was Carol's first day at work. She was traveling to Martinsville, Indiana, with 3 of her coworkers who were 2 white men and a 19-year-old black woman. They hoped that they would find customers there who would buy their encyclopedias. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, Martinsville City was a sundown town, which meant that they practiced racism. Black people were not allowed to live or visit communities in Martinsville after sunset. There were signs at the city limits that said, "Nigger, don't let the sun go down, get down on you over here." Black people who attempted to enter or live in these communities were often subjected to violence, lynching, and other forms of racial terror. In many cases, the police and other authorities turned a blind eye to these acts of violence, perpetuating the culture of fear and exclusion. So the white people segregated themselves from the black people, and they didn't allow them to live there with them. Now, on September 16th, 1968, Carol, who was wearing a brown wool coat, a white turtleneck, olive green pants, and a yellow scarf, believed that she would be safe and travel freely in Martinsville, since was going there with 2 white people who were her coworkers and also her fellow black woman. Carol wanted to impress her supervisors, even though she knew the dangers that were ahead. Unfortunately, her parents had no idea that she was going there. Their journey was good, and they arrived in Martinsville, Indiana, at around 4:30 p.m. They decided to split up all around the town so that they can go door to door. The 3 then planned to meet up at a gas station at around 10 p.m. so that they can leave that city and go back to Rushville City. Carol began going from home to home, knocking on white people's doors, introducing herself and asking them if they could buy Collier's encyclopedias. At around 7:30 p.m., she was all alone walking through the streets of Martinsville. Then suddenly she started being followed by two white men in a car. They were catcalling at her, hurling racist slurs at her, and intimidating her. Fearing for her safety, Carol approached a nearby home and knocked on the door of a young white married couple who were known as Don and Norma Neal. She asked them to help her because some people were following her. Fortunately, the couple were kind and let her in. When Don Neal stepped outside, he saw a light-colored sedan car, but he couldn't see anyone inside. However, the car lights were on. He approached the car to get a better look. After getting closer, he took the number plate of the vehicle. Suddenly, the car drove off when he was returning to the house. The couple then called 911 and waited with Carol until the police arrived. They then gave them the description of the car, and the officers tracked down two white men who admitted to following Carol. However, they added that they did nothing to harm her. And so, nothing came from the incident, and the police left. After the police had left, Carol explained to the couple that she was a door-to-door saleswoman and was trying to meet up with her coworkers. So the Neals walked Carol several blocks to see if they could find her coworkers. They looked everywhere, but they could not find them, so they returned back to their house. They told Carol that she was welcome to stay at their home until it was time to meet up with her coworkers. Unfortunately, Carol declined the offer by telling them that she did not want to trouble them further. At around 8:30 p.m., Carol thanked them for their hospitality, and then she walked off and headed to the gas station where she was supposed to meet her coworkers and together head back to Rushville. About 15 to 30 minutes later, another group of people, that is a man named Kenneth Clay Richmond and his friend who were drunk, they saw Carol walking on the road and was on her way to find her colleagues. Kenneth and his friend were from Hendricks County, which was also racist. Kenneth had a history of violence and was a well-known racist with ties to extremist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which was popularly known as KKK. Kenneth was with her 7-year-old daughter, who was known as Shirley Richmond McQueen. So they quickly sped behind Carol, and Shirley, who was sitting at the back seat, remained in the car as Kenneth and his friend jumped out and ran to Carol. When Carol saw them running towards her, she freaked out and started running away from them, but they caught up with her in no time. The other man grabbed her and held her arms behind her back, and Kenneth pulled out a screwdriver and stabbed her in the chest with it. They then got back in the car, laughing and joking about how she got what she deserved. Because Shirley had witnessed the crime and also saw how Carol passed out when they were leaving, her father, Kenneth, offered her $7 so that she won't tell anybody about what they did. He promised to pay her $1 for each year that she will be alive in exchange for her silence. They then fled away from the crime scene. Carol then went stumbling down the street, and when she reached near the corner of Morgan and Lincoln Streets, she collapsed on the sidewalk. A teen boy who lived across the street discovered her and ran into a nearby restaurant to call the police. It was raining and it was dark, and soon the police arrived at the scene and found her unresponsive, and they didn't know what had happened to her. They called the paramedics who arrived at the scene. They didn't examine her. Instead, they simply rushed her to Morgan County Hospital without trying to find out what was wrong with her. Unfortunately, the Carol died shortly after arriving at the hospital. When the body was taken for an autopsy, they took her wool coat off, and that is when they saw a single small and narrow stab wound in her chest, and her sweater was soaked in blood. The stab wound was so deep that it pierced her heart and caused massive internal bleeding, leading to her death. There was no any other injuries on Carol's body, and the stab wound confirmed that the weapon used to murder her was a screwdriver. After Paul and Elizabeth had lived together for so long, their relationship had become rocky, and they later on divorced each other. Elizabeth got married again, and they adopted a son whom they named Philip Scott. The coroner then called the Carol's mother and informed her that her daughter was dead, a news which she received with a great disbelief. The Martinsville Police Department didn't employ any detective-grade personnel, so the county sheriff and the Indiana State Police took over the investigations. The police had not secured the crime scene using a police tape because they didn't know that Carol had been murdered until she had been examined. When they began working on the case, they found about 50 people who had earlier on heard about the crime walking all over the crime scene, contaminating evidences. When the police arrived there, they taped the crime scene as they started looking for evidences. People began picking up evidences at the crime scene with their bare hands and handing them to the police. Therefore, some of the items had been touched by multiple people, thereby contaminating them. The evidences were therefore inadmissible in court because they had so many different people's DNA on them. It had also rained at night, so other evidences had been washed away, so the only evidence that the police found useful was Carol's glasses. As they continued with their investigations, they were able to find Carol's notebook, which was a few blocks away from where her body laid. The notebook was near an auto body shop, so the police suspected that the owner of the shop was involved in Carol's death, so they arrested him and brought him in for questioning. They also arrested a construction worker who they suspected to have been involved in Carol's killing. The two suspects were interviewed, and they then took a polygraph test and a lie detector test. Unfortunately, they both passed those tests, and they were ruled out as suspects in Carol's murder. A few weeks later, the construction worker left the state and moved to Florida. This made the police to become more suspicious of him. They followed up on him so that they can ask him why he moved. Unfortunately, a month later, they found out the construction worker had died in a shooting in Florida. Police were able to track down the dark-colored sedan car that had followed her that day and determined that two white men had been driving it. They denied shouting at her and were quickly ruled out as suspects. Don and Norma Neal also went to the investigators and gave out the information that they had about Carol. They even explained to them how they hosted her on the day she died when she was being followed by two white men in a car. The people in Martinsville City refused to speak about what happened to Carol. Carol's murder investigation became very cold. There was no lead in the investigations, and there were no witnesses. Therefore, the case went cold. The newspapers that reported this case referred to Carol Jenkins as a black nigga instead of using her real name. They started to share the details of Carol's day up until the day she was murdered. The newspaper highlighted how Carol was stalked and had to take refuge at Norma and Don's house. When the residents of Martinsville found about the story, they really got angry at Norma and Don for offering refuge to Carol, who was a black woman while she was in a sundown town. This was against their rules to have non-white people at Martinsville City after the sun goes down. So the couple received so much hate. Their house was vandalized. They were harassed in the streets, and they even received death threats and hate mails. In spite of all of this, Norma and Don did not back down in fighting for justice for Carol. Paul Davis was adamant that because Martinsville was a sundown town with a history of racism, the police weren't taking her case seriously. So he demanded that Martinsville police to get the FBI involved in the case since they couldn't solve it by themselves. The police told him that they can't do what he was requesting, and they went ahead and closed the case without finding Carol's killers. They informed him that the FBI had more important things to worry about apart from this case. The police were not willing to reopen the case even after they had campaigned for it many times. 33 years later, a 40-year-old woman who was known as Shirley Richmond McQueen had confided in her sister-in-law, a woman who was known as Connie, about how her father, Kenneth Clay Richmond, and his friend murdered Carol. After Connie, who also happened to be her best friend, heard the confession, she decided to give out this information on behalf of Shirley, so she called Carol's mother in June 2000. She didn't identify herself to Carol's mother. Instead, she simply said that her dad killed Carol, and she hanged up. When Elizabeth heard the story, she told Paul about what the caller had said. Paul then used his retirement savings to hire a private investigator to investigate their daughter's murder. The private investigator was known as William McAllister, and he was an ex-state trooper. Surprisingly, when the Indiana State Police learned that Paul had hired a private investigator to look into their daughter's murder, they decided to assign two cold case investigators to reinvestigate Carol's murder case. The investigators persuaded Paul and his team of private investigator that they were working on finding Carol's killers. So the investigators asked Paul and his team to trust them and share with them whatever information they had. So Paul, a couple of his family members, and their attorney traveled to meet with the detectives. He trusted the Indiana state detectives and shared with them the information that he and his private detective had gathered. The Indiana state detectives then began following up on the case. About a year later, in November 2001, Connie sent a letter to the Indiana police, and the letter read, "My dad killed Carol." In the letter, Connie mentioned the name of Carol's killer to be Kenneth Clay Richmond. After receiving the tip, the investigators decided to follow up on the lead, and they were able to discover that the tip had originally came from a 40-year-old woman named Shirley Richmond McQueen, who was the daughter of Kenneth Clay Richmond, who was alleged to be Carol's killer. So they brought her in for an interview. During the questioning, Shirley told the investigators about how her father and his friend murdered Carol on the night of 16th September 1968. That night, she watched from the back seat of her father's car as her father and another man chased Carol down and stabbed her in the chest using a screwdriver. Shirley even described the exact clothes Carol was wearing that night, details which had never been released to the public. She added that she hadn't spoken to her father for the last 24 years after they had fallen out in the late 1970s because she didn't want anything to do with him again. The investigators now had enough evidence to arrest Kenneth, and so on. May 8, 2002, Kenneth Clay Richmond, who was 70 years old by then, was arrested by the police for the murder of Carol Jenkins. Unfortunately, Kenneth was battling bladder cancer, and he was living in a nursing home. When investigators interviewed him, he denied having anything to do with Carol's murder. However, the evidence that police had was enough to charge him. Unfortunately, in August 2002, a judge declared him incompetent to stand trial in court because he was seriously sick. Unfortunately, in September 2002, 4 months after his arrest, Kenneth Richmond succumbed to bladder cancer. To make the matters worse, his accomplice, who was with him during the murder, was never identified because Shirley didn't know his name. So Carol's murder case is still open even now. Dawn and Norma continued to fight for justice for Carol, who was murdered because of racism. In the year 2014, they proposed that a monument should be made in Martinsville City to honor her memory because she was murdered in that city. Unfortunately, when the monument was about to be made, Norman Voiles, who was the county commissioner of Martinsville City, started getting flack about erecting the monument from the residents, so he canceled that request. But on November 1st, 2017, a community park in Rushville was rededicated and named after Carol, and it is called the Carol Jenkins Davis Park. The following day, a memory stone was put up in the garden of Martinsville City Hall, and Rushville High School dedicated a monument for her.